I am a very ordinary person, and I found myself in rather extraordinary circumstances. And the way I look at it is that I was the right person in the right place at the right time, and God gave me the strength to do the right thing.
Without Siobhan O'Connor, the Diocese of Buffalo may have pulled off one of the greatest cover-ups in the history of the Catholic Church. O'Connor served for 3 years as Bishop Richard Malone's personal secretary. She's deeply religious and once studied to become a nun. But while working at Malone's side, she began to see the ugly underbelly of how the Diocese of Buffalo handled sexual abuse. She went public earlier today as a key whistleblower and source in 7 Eyewitness News' 3-part I-Team investigation into Malone's handling of sexual abuse, telling the national news magazine 60 Minutes that she felt morally compelled to provide key documents describing a cover-up of allegations under Malone's watch. Before the airing of the 60 Minutes piece, O'Connor explained to 7 Eyewitness News that the seeds for her actions were planted in March, when the diocese announced a settlement program for victims of sexual abuse. The diocese was so unprepared for the wave of allegations that she began taking phone calls from victims, many who had waited years for justice from the church.
And then I began to be attached to these people. I mean, they shared their lives with me, and I cried with them, and I cared about them.
Publicly, Bishop Malone said he wanted victims to come forward, but a hotline created by the diocese rang to an empty office in Cheektowaga, manned remotely by a part-time employee. All calls for the first 3 weeks went directly to voicemail. After waiting weeks for a return call, O'Connor says victims began showing up at the chancery to tell their stories. O'Connor listened to one man's story in a supply closet because the diocese had set aside no space to hear these victims.
And he told me that his wife had died a few years ago, and he hadn't even told her, and then he shared what he had endured, and I was just, I was really overcome in that moment, because you just can see how raw that pain is, and I wished I could do more for him.
O'Connor was moved to write a newspaper opinion piece in June, where she said victims deserved compassion, not criticism.
I remember finding out after the fact that Bishop Malone was not pleased with the article I wrote, because he said that it was not supportive enough of him. It was overly supportive of the victims. And I was told by another member of senior staff that I had an inordinate sympathy for the victims. And I don't think that's possible.
But it was Malone's handling of 2 accused priests that finally convinced her it was time to quit her job. She wrote in emails to the bishop that she was becoming morally allergic to that job.
I already knew at that point that things were not self-correcting. It wasn't as though the diocese had just kind of careened off the path and were righting themselves. Things were not going in the right direction, and I thought you were the one who might be able to help the most from the outside.
That's when I approached O'Connor, and we had the first of many secret meetings in this abandoned parking lot. She began to reveal a trove of secret documents that implicated Bishop Malone in the mishandling of clergy sexual abuse allegations.
And I remember thinking that I would trust you with this information, that you would not treat it in a salacious manner. I could tell you had great compassion for the victims, and that you also had respect for our church.
Exposing the bishop's actions was not a decision O'Connor came to easily.
I devoted my life to working for him. I knew him very well. He had invited me into his home. I had traveled with him. And yet I realized that sometimes you have to have a loyalty to something greater, and an allegiance to the common good versus someone's personal good. And especially when I thought about the survivors, I thought I would be betraying them if I didn't do something.
The explosive information has led to calls for Bishop Malone to resign. On the advice of church lawyers, he called an emergency news conference 3 days after our first bombshell I-Team investigation and admitted wrongdoing but refused to resign.
The shepherd does not desert the flock at a difficult time.
By the end of it, I was in tears because it was just business as usual. A task force, a new office, a new staff member, strengthening the code of conduct. There's nothing wrong with the code of conduct. It needs to be enforced. And there were so many things he could have done, and he didn't. Instead, they They locked down those files, and it went just to protect the diocese, protect the bishop.
Sources say those aggressive moves are one reason the FBI has now launched a criminal investigation into the diocese. O'Connor feels the scrutiny is a long time coming, but knows it will take a toll on her former colleagues.
I think that I'm going to lose a lot of friends because of this, because I brought pain upon them. I brought dark days to the Catholic Center.
O'Connor was ready to pay the price for speaking truth to the most powerful institution on earth, but says she now feels at peace for standing up for what was right.
I remember thinking, even if they put me in jail, at least in jail I would have a clear conscience. But I would have been imprisoned by regret for my whole life if I didn't do this. So in a certain sense, as much as I did it for the survivors and for our diocese and our community, I did it for myself too, because I couldn't have walked away and lived with myself. So I was really compelled to do this in many respects, but for my own soul.
Now, we gave Bishop Malone a chance to respond to his former secretary. He declined to comment for this story. As for any potential fallout for O'Connor, she is now represented by Boston attorney Mitchell Garabedian, who helped uncover the sexual abuse crisis in that city and is considered one of the foremost attorneys when it comes to sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. For the I-Team, Charlie Speck, 7 Eyewitness News.